Thank you for always tuning in on our podcast. Welcome and thank you. Have you ever wondered what neurolinguistics programming is and what this has to do with DEI? A recent article that I read on the Columbia University website stated that over the same period, an explosion of research in neuroscience has brought us increasingly closer to the neural underpinnings of our innermost thoughts and emotions. And as a result, brain imaging and other emerging technologies can not only predict some of our behaviors, in some instances, they can alter how we behave. Suppose improving DEI is one of our most urgent societal concerns. Neuroscience provides some of the most advanced tools to understand the brain and behavior. How should we be thinking about shaping the future of diversity research? This illustrates how DEI and the underpinnings of our thoughts affects our behavior. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. And for a living, I help thought-provoking leaders implement intentional DEI workshops in their workplace. When you tune in, not only will you have better insights on all our experiences, it will allow room for self-reflection. My share is that when we reflect on our innermost thoughts, we can advance or destruct workplace cultures. Dr. Maisha Claiborne is an integrative family physician, master practitioner of NLP, hypnosis, and timeline therapy, and the founder of the Mind Remapping Academy. With over 20 years of experience, she helps her clients transform their lives by assisting them to master their thoughts, which is what we're talking about today, beliefs, and communication while eliminating fear, imposter syndrome, self doubt, negative emotions, and passing down trauma. That's a big one
Yes.
that gets in the way of their ability to experience complete joy, productivity, and peace of mind. Welcome, Dr. Claiborne.
Thank you, Rochelle. It is so wonderful to be on the show with you, and for the remainder of the show, please call me Maisha.
Right. I will. I will. That's going to make everybody more comfortable, right?
It is, it
Yeah.
is, it is, yes.
Yeah.
And as you know, first of all, I just love the introduction because I think a lot of people don't really get the science behind our language and our behavior patterns and the connection to our brain, and there's not enough research being done, but it's wonderful that places like Columbia University are starting to really look at the connection between, the brain behavior and our language and the way we speak.
Right. Absolutely. And do you think there's, you know, when we're talking about the unconscious mind, is there a disparity between our intentions and the impression we give people?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. It's funny, I think I just did a maybe a live on this a few days ago, the intention versus our impact. You know, we grow up with these various experiences,
Right.
with these values, with these belief systems. And so in our minds, we are meaning well sometimes. Of course, there are the people who mean to say what they say. And then there are some people who they're just doing what they're doing what they're programmed to do, saying what they're programmed to say based on past experiences. And the intention does not match the impact that happens.
Can you repeat that? The intention does not match the impact. What is it that you mean?
What I mean by that is someone can, let's take backhanded compliments, for example. Someone might say, "Oh, you speak so well," right? To me, that's what I grew up hearing in
Right.
Alabama.
Right.
And it would seem as though that's a compliment. But in actuality, there's a belief pattern that, you know, Black people, people of color, maybe don't speak well generally, or
Right.
have, problems articulating certain things. And so it's really a backhanded compliment. Now, the intention was to compliment, but the impact unconsciously is something else, because it does give one sort of this weird, like, thank you, I guess, kind of
Right.
reaction. That's what I mean by intention versus impact.
Right. So, do you think that, and it's interesting, I've had this conversation with another NLP coach, and we talked about the impact of words on ourselves
Mhm.
and, dialogues that we have within us and how physically impactful they really are. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So the words that come out of our mouth each day, the sentences, the things that we speak about are always being heard by our own ears. And so when we speak, we're actually giving our unconscious mind commands, unbeknownst to most people. And we are hearing all kinds of information. I mean, the statistic is that there's probably I think it's 2 billion bits of information that come at us per second. And so our brain has to filter this information.
2 billion? That just stressed me out.
Right. We're not aware of that. Our brain can only process 134 bits of information per second. We have 2 billion bits of information, and our brain's only processing 134 bits per second. Then you can imagine there's a lot of filtering happening, right? And it filters through our beliefs, our values, our experiences, all of those things. And some of those things that it filters through are our internal dialogues.
So, are you saying that the information that we're actually processing and filtering becomes our internal dialogues?
So here's what happens. It does, but there's a little step that happens before that. So that we're filtering this information through those filters I mentioned, and I just named a few of them. There are a few more. And then what happens is our brain creates a picture of what we think has happened based on the filter. Then, based on that picture, we have our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, that aspect of our reaction or response internally. And that's what creates the reaction itself. That's what creates the external response.
So, where does trauma fit in?
Well, so trauma it creates the filter itself. Trauma is part of the thing that installs the filter. And it becomes the filter eventually. So for example, if we and most times trauma happens very early in life, whether it's at a big T or a little t, let's call it that, right? Because if you think about it, the things that happen to us that we see, that we experience when we're 5, look different to us when we're 35. That's why I say big T or little t, right?
Ah,
So there are traumas, bigger traumas, smaller traumas that happen, or multiple small traumas that happen that
right.
are just as impactful as sort of one big trauma. And we have that experience. It's called a significant emotional event, and it creates decisions. It creates beliefs in us about ourselves a lot of times, sometimes about others, and then about the world. That is what becomes the filter through which we live our life.
Ah.
Okay. And so then what happens is our brain is then programmed to build evidence for that belief is true, until we
Mm.
become aware that trauma, that first significant emotional event, or the multiple small ones, are the filter through which we're seeing. And that is what determines a lot of times our behavior and our actions and reactions and communications.
So that would also determine the quality of our relationships.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Relationships at work, relationships romantically, relationships with our children, relationships with friends, whether we have relationships at all.
Ha! Whether
Really?
we have relationships at all, that's a very good point,
Yeah.
because that could that could perpetuate a state of loneliness,
Yes. Isolation and
isolation.
withdrawal. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've spoken with many, many people who, as a result of their trauma or their repetitive trauma, or their big trauma, or their repetitive trauma, have come to isolate themselves and have very little community or friendships.
Interesting. And so okay, if you can explain, I have many thoughts actually in my head going on right now. So if you can explain a little bit again for, those of you who are tuning in, what NLP is, what it does, and how can we benefit from NLP through you?
Yeah, so I've spent many, many years refining and refining the way, defining and redefining and refining the way that I explain this. And what it boils down to is this: neurolinguistic programming, which we call NLP, programming is the way we leverage our language. We use our language to influence and impact the way we think, to remove bad habits, bad thinking habits, bad communication habits, habits across the board, and to install and create new ones that will produce different results in our lives. So we use our language to reprogram our brain, our brain, the internal, unconscious thought patterns that are not serving us anymore, so that we can live at our highest state of excellence. And how that is done is through specific techniques and learning specific language patterns, so that we're intentionally and actively giving ourselves very specific commands. Now, this is interesting because we are all suggestible.
What do you mean?
Well, we all have the capacity to accept ideas and beliefs that come from others all of the time. We have
Correct.
opportunity for that on television. If people watching the news, on social media, we are all very suggestible. And what neurolinguistic programming does is it makes you aware of that and puts you in control of the filters that you're allowing to be in place. It puts you in control of the programming itself, because you now have the tools and the language patterns. And what it also does is it gives you a specific way of listening that allows you to be with people in a different kind of way, meaning
Mm.
communicate with people in a way that lowers resistance in them and in you, so that conflict becomes less and less, or more and more easily resolved.
Because the likelihood then, so this is very interesting. So the likelihood of meeting, I'm jumbling up my words, meeting someone who doesn't operate like you is great,
Mhm,
right? Let's say in the workplace, in
mhm,
friendships, social settings.
mhm.
So if someone like you were coaching me on those techniques, then I would be able to bridge that gap between myself and the other person who doesn't operate like me.
Absolutely. One of the key assumptions in neurolinguistic programming is respect for other people's model of the world. So get
Ah,
what I'm saying here is, respect, and I have to like really say this again because I think people collapse respect with agreement.
ah,
And so respect, whether or not you agree or believe in or subscribe to that person's belief system or model of the world, respect for one's model of the world, right? Doesn't mean you have to agree, doesn't mean you have to like it, doesn't mean you have to, but respecting meaning it's sort of an acknowledgement of that exists. Number
Right.
one. Um, Another big assumption is that people are not their behaviors. So what that allows
Right.
for us to do is change the behavior, see the humanity and change the behavior.
How would that work with kids?
Oh,
Is
well,
this a whole other show?
this, well, I'll give you a tidbit, but yes,
Yeah.
we can go real deep on that.
I
But
know.
with kids, and this is really great because um, with kids, especially, and I speak personally of my son, right? They're so impressionable. It's easy to do, right? The behavior
Ah,
patterns, they're so impressionable and they're like sponges. So it's actually much easier to do than an adult because the adult, the kid has not had all of the filters installed. We as adults, we've had so many life experiences that we've got filter after filter after filter after filter that's being installed. So with children, if we understand, and especially, we start to understand the developmental stages of children, then we can see that, like, for example, my son, he is at this stage, he's 7, he just turned 7. He's at this stage where, he's always correcting me.
oh yes, my daughter as well.
And, you know, yeah, he's correcting, he's negotiating, if I put, like, this morning, for example, I put his clothes out. It was dress up day. It was to dress up with his favorite book character, and we had agreed on some clothes. So then he knocks on the door this morning and says, "Mommy, I want to put on this different shirt because I think it matches the pants a little bit better." And you know, at first I was like, I was thinking to myself, just put the clothes out there. But I was like, I stopped myself and I said, okay, because I understand that he's at a stage of development where he's really trying to ground himself in autonomy and being confident to make his choices. So it's the developmental stage that he's in. He is not, as a child, a contrarian. He's not a contrarian. But sometimes his words and his behaviors would reflect that way. So when I
Um,
understand that he is not him, it's his developmental stage, it's the way his neurology is being developed, then I can give space for, yeah, all right, go put on whatever shirt you want to put on today if you think it matches. And at the end of the day, he ended up changing back to the shirt that I put out in the first place.
Interesting.
So when we respect other people's model of the world, when we understand that people are, you know, they're doing the best they can with the resources that they have, and their behaviors are separate from who they are most times. And these are assumptions. This is not the truth, but these are assumptions we take on. It
Correct.
allows us to connect with people in a way that lowers their resistance so that they can hear what we're saying. So when we talk about change, we talk about the DEI space and a lot of the work that's being done in that space. We're always going to be running up against these obstacles. People who are like, "What? Why do we need this?" I just was having a conversation with another fellow DEI consultant, where an organizational leader says, "Well, this is taking away from more pressing things." Like they didn't understand why this was important, and being able to navigate these kind of um, barriers and people takes a flexibility of behavior. And when we have
So it's
that,
like an openness,
exactly. Oh,
being
and really,
receptive.
yeah, receptive openness, but really like flexibility, like the ability to navigate effectively certain spaces. And this is not like the same as bending over backwards. It's not the same as code switching. It's really neurologically being flexible so that you can say, yes, I understand that you feel this way. And here, like, think about it from this angle. Now, does it sound important to you?
Mm,
See what I'm saying? And
right.
that's the flexibility behavior that in these spaces can lower the resistance to our work.
Mm. To look. So, well, then that would have involve a lot of emotional intelligence then.
Exactly. And
Right.
that's one of the things that NLP does. It increases emotional intelligence and it increases conversational intelligence.
Uh, interesting. So how would you successfully lead or influence and coach people whose values and beliefs, emotional intelligence, mindsets, and worldviews are different from yours? Because there's always in order to persuade someone, or maybe maybe I'm projecting, in order to persuade someone to understand your point of view, I think there's an element of there's still that little there's a resistance to bring the person over to your side so
Mhm.
they can understand your perspective. How would you, again, I mean, we talked about it, but probably we can dive a little deeper. How would we be able to bridge that gap if there's if we're all so different?
Mhm.
And again, it's probably the languages. I think I answered my own question. You were talking about
Yeah.
how we how we communicate to the other person.
This is really a good question. I really want to dig into this for a moment because one of the things we say about, you know, neurolinguistic programming is that it takes a willingness to explore and be curious. And so even though we might be so I think first of all, we have to go on without an agenda, without the agenda of the in order to. There's a quote,
Right.
and I don't want to misquote who said it, but it's first seek to understand, right? And so in neurolinguistic programming, I have to look up who said that quote, and maybe someone will put it in the comments for me for us when we complete the show on the replay. But when when we look at people's behaviors, we look at them with curiosity. Like, how could a person possibly produce that behavior? Right? Neurologically speaking, like what would a person, and that's a lot of, my work is like, well, okay, what has you think and believe the way you believe? What could it be that actually has you produce this kind of behavior?
Right.
And when you get curious about that and you start to even allow yourself to step into someone else's shoes, there's a
Right.
technique we teach called perceptual positions. It allows you to take three different positions. You take the first position, which is through your own eyes. You take the second position, which is through the eyes of the person that you're dealing with, that you're in conflict with, the system or the organization or whatever it is. And then you take the third position, which is the fly on the wall. It allows you to see the big picture view.
Right.
Most recently, research has inserted a fourth position, which is more of a meta position. It's that societal view, right? Which for
Mm.
us is very key because there's the organizational review, view, there's the personal view, and then there's the big picture. But then there's the societal, which would be the culture, the white supremacy culture that influences everything inside the system.
Hmm.
So when you begin to, we call it chunk up, when you begin to like sort of chunk up and look at these various, be in these various positions, being curious about, well, what is it that would have someone produce a behavior? Then you can actually authentically empathize, authentically acknowledge, authentically communicate to lower that resistance.
So an example of that would be simple, something super simple for the audience to understand would be a you had a disagreement in the morning with family members before leaving for work, and you get to work and you're pretty snarky
Mhm.
and you're resistant, you're your emotions are just not in tune. You're not feeling aligned because of what happened at home. So
Mhm.
then knowing that would be would lower the resistance in communicating with the person and knowing how to communicate with the person if you knew the background.
It could. It absolutely could.
Mm.
I'll give you a really on the core example that happened yesterday with my son, literally.
Okay.
So we're driving home from his best friend's birthday party, and it's past his bedtime, and we also hadn't eaten because we had to leave a little early before the fixins. So he's hungry, I'm hungry, and we both get hangry. So he inherited hangry from me.
Oh, yes.
So we're driving home, and everything out of his mouth is a complaint, and I'm feeling it in my body like, "Rrr, I don't want to hear your complaints."
Yeah.
And so we're kind of like back and forth. And then at some point I realized he's hungry and I'm hungry. I think you and I talked about this just yesterday on my
Yesterday.
podcast, right?
Yeah.
I'm halting, he's halting. And so I said to him, because this is where you chunk up to the common experience. I
Right.
said, I said, Delson, you know what? You're hungry and cranky. I'm hungry and cranky. Why don't we just have quiet time for the rest of the ride home? Because otherwise, we're going to be fighting all the way home, and it's just going to make us madder and madder. Can we agree to that? And he says, yes. And I turned on the music, and we were silent the whole way home.
Wow.
That's how it works on kids. But it also works that way with adults. Because what I all I did there was recognize, we're kind of in our, and I just chucked us up to agreement. We both agreed that we were hungry and tired, and it was a long ride home. Well, long being like 20 minutes, which is a long time for a kid to be hungry, and quite frankly, a long time for me to be hungry too. And so in adults, it's the same way. It's
Right.
like if you're in a team and everybody's like, right, you start to say, well, what is the big picture that we all want?
Right.
I understand you view it this way. I understand you have this view of it, but we all want the same thing. Now, how can we take each of our strengths, each of our views? What are we each willing to let go of so that we can create the vision the way we want it to create?
Right. 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 So it's learning what motivates different personalities and how to tailor and adapt your communication skill to gain people's trust rather to go against their grain. you
Right.
you know you gain their trust.
Yeah. It's listening for what's important to them.
That's really hard to do. Right.
It is, because we have to, for a moment, set aside what's important to us to hear what's important to them. But if we set aside in the moment in a conversation and communication what's important for us and our agenda, and then we can hear what's important to them. And sometimes you can find the common thread in that. Sometimes you
Right.
cannot, right?
Right.
Sometimes what's important to me is not what's important to this person, and we can acknowledge that. And that's another pathway for communication. Okay, I acknowledge this is important to me, but it is not important to you. Or what do we do now?
Right.
Right? Because I believe everything can be resolved in communication, but we don't do that. We talk.
Why?
Well, filters and limiting decisions and the need to hold on tightly to our own worldview individually, such
uh,
that we are so right about
uh,
everything.
right.
And not being right is a threat. It's a perceived threat. It's not an actual threat, but not
Right.
being right is a perceived threat to our existence.
Right.
And for many people is, often based and rooted in trauma.
Hmm. So remapping would be reframing or recreating new neurotransmitters. Does that make sense? Was that what it does? Or is it simply in linguistics?
In essence, the tools and techniques and language patterns that one learns in that process of neurolinguistic programming and some of the other techniques like hypnosis, Milton Erickson hypnosis patterns, and timeline therapy, that is the process of remapping one's mind. That is the process. And what you're doing is you are forming new neurological connections in the
Right.
brain to be able to speak, respond, be different than before. And it takes practice.
Lots of it.
Magic. Not magic. It is, sometimes it looks like magic though. I mean, I've done some things that people are like, how did you do that? So, when you get really practiced in it, it can appear like magic, but really it's simply brain science. It's neuroscience.
And that's what it boils down to. It's neuroscience. Is this something that's fairly new? Where did it originate from? I was reading an article. Actually, I think it was on the it was on either on the Columbia website or Harvard Business Review, one of the two. And they neuroscience is big in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, where is it something that's fairly new? And I don't like to use the word trending, but it's come more to light now than ever before. Or is that something that
I think so? First of all, it's not, well, context is decisive, right? So
right.
new in the standpoint of it's been around for some, probably close to 100 years or so, right?
Okay.
The truth is, there's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
There are texts and bodies of work that show that hypnosis has been around since the days of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, called by many names. Right. Neurolinguistic programming was sort of derived, is sort of branched off at some point of hypnosis in one direction, while behavioral psychology branched in the other direction.
Mm.
So it derives from hypnosis.
Right.
And it's continually to be studied. And because in the context of new, I guess you could say, I'm thinking about the timeline chart. Yeah, I think it's probably about 100 years old. So relatively new.
Right.
Relatively new to the world, but not like 10 years or 20 years or 30 years new. Yeah.
Right.
And there was something else that I think you asked me, where did it come from? And is it new?
I had read articles that a lot of people in Japan.
Oh, if it was trending.
If it was trending. Yeah.
What I would say is that in other countries, I believe there's much more awareness and usage of it.
Right.
I think here in our country, we are just scratching the surface of its usefulness, of the importance of it. And once again, I can say, there's the culture and there's all kinds of reasons, because neurolinguistic programming, as a physician, it's very useful in healing as well. And so, there are a lot of things to be lost, pockets to be, sifted out of,
right,
for this work really coming to light. So I say we've just scratched the surface, and it's growing, and the awareness is growing. I think worldwide, even still, we've just scratched the surface as well, but it's been around. And I think the more that we educate ourselves on the benefits of it and begin to not just educate around it, because I think that's sort of what we do in our industry, is like we're just reading articles on it, reading articles in medicine, reading articles, gathering evidence, but not actually applying it. But when you learn the tools
Right.
because it's so much different to read about it than to actually experience it and to learn the tools and experience how it makes a difference in one's life. It's just night and day. It's earth and space is what it is. And
Interesting.
yeah.
So I had two thoughts.
Mhm.
The one was when we're tying neurolinguistic programming with diversity, equity, inclusion,
Mhm.
the perspective or my perspective is that in order for, because it usually comes from the leaders or HR top down, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So in order to create a different mindset, not change the person, but to create a different mindset
Mhm.
about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I see how neuro linguistic programming fits right in
Absolutely.
because then they can actually change their or modify or become aware of their
Mhm.
unconscious biases,
Mhm.
implicit, explicit,
Mhm.
microaggressions, micro insults,
Mhm.
backhanded comments. Would that enable, business owners and thought-provoking leaders to to open the realm about being more diverse in their corporate space?
Absolutely. And it goes even deeper than that. I always say we're trying to change this system, but who makes up the system? People make up the system.
Right.
So if we have someone, we have a CEO, we have a CFO, a CMO, we have the DEI leaders, we have the officers and leaders and champions, we have the employee resource leaders, right? We have so many levels at which this can impact. But let's take it from the top. So we have a CEO, we have the board's members who are wanting to change the culture. They're wanting to be, you know, allies and anti-racists. And they experience the discomfort. They experience the internal resistance,
Mm.
right? Or sometimes they don't even know that it's resistance. They're just saying what they're saying because they're wondering, they're bumping up against something.
Right.
Well, there's always an unconscious decision or belief that precedes all of that.
I'm
So
writing down some notes. Okay.
so this work, what it does is it allows for um, this group of people to get to the root of, well, how did they become to believe what they believe, and what is the resistance coming from exactly? Where is the resistance coming from? How is that limiting them in being able to do the work they really want to do in their culture, in their organization? The discomfort of having these conversations about race, where does that actually come from for the leader that's not a person of color?
Right.
Where does that come? Where does that discomfort come from? I have several non people of color friends who will come to me and say, well, I want to do something, but I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. I'm afraid to do the wrong
Right.
thing. I'm afraid to, right? And again, with curiosity, you can say, oh, well, when was the first time you ever were afraid to do the wrong thing in a context like this? Like what happened? And you can really get to the root of that. And then you can really see, oh, you can really recontextualize that initial significant emotional event that had them get stuck at saying the wrong thing. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to do the wrong thing. Like have them get stuck there. And then when they release that, it empowers them to be able to speak themselves authentically and be willing to, as we say, as we kind of said yesterday, when you mess up, clean up,
Right.
right? To be courageous, to be in a brave space, because quite honestly, it takes a brave space. This work takes a brave space from both sides, from the side of the well, from all sides, because it's not
Right.
just two sides, right? So there's the side of the CEOs, the leaders who are trying to change the culture, the side of people like us who are doing the work to change the culture, the side of the impacted communities,
Right.
right? To speak up for when something is being said that is unacceptable,
Right. Being an ally.
right? Being an ally or being a person of color who speaks up for themselves, because we're
Right.
conditioned not to do that,
To not
right?
speak up for ourselves.
Right. We're,
Right.
we're, we're conditioned to keep our head low, especially when you're in a job where speaking up could jeopardize your well-being. I mean, your livelihood,
You're
your
right.
main source of income, right?
Right.
So we're programmed in all these various ways. And what the neurolinguistic programming does is allow us to understand why we're programmed that way, and gives us
Mm,
the tools to begin to um, deconstruct and unravel those things that had us be programmed that way, so that we can be in those brave spaces and make the change that we want to make, both in ourselves and our communities and our corporations, our cultures, our businesses.
right. And it's interesting because I see how we could bridge the gap and how we can possibly work together, but we'll talk about that backstage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm realizing that you just said some beautiful, powerful words, to deconstruct,
Mm-hmm.
because we're working through all our filters.
Mm-hmm.
We all have all these lived experiences,
Mm-hmm.
and we're functioning according to those experiences and those filters.
Absolutely.
So in implementing, intentional workshops, which I love to call intentional, then having, you know, an NLP coach like you come in and do this first
Mm.
and then implement the
Yeah.
DEI, and then we can talk about microaggressions, and this would lead to a more receptive communication.
Make your job a lot easier. But really, I mean, and you know, one of the other things that I talked about was the impact on the level of the DEI within an organization, the
Right.
DEI leaders within an organization, and the employee resource group leaders, because the I imagine, and I've spoken with several, organizational DEI leaders who this work is stressful. And no matter what aspect we're coming from, we still are coming from our own life experiences and our own experience of having had trauma. And this work digs up it all. This like DEI work, ally work, all that, that work brings up all of our traumas. And I can say that because I know it to be true for me. Like I think that for those people who know me, who have followed me as a physician, an integrative medicine physician for so many years, I never thought I'd see myself in this space. But I got called into it after the murder of George Floyd, after the sequential murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. It was just too much. And I thought to myself, I have to use, like, this has such utility and it's not being touched. And so it can be stressful, and it can drag up those traumas. And then as a leader in the space, from wherever you are, whether you're consulting and you're giving workshops as a called in consultant, or whether you're internal and you're charged with leading these various initiatives, you still bump up against that resistance. Employee resource group leaders, it's the same thing. They bump up against the resistance of their group board members or their group leaders that are under them, that come from their own life experiences, that have their own, when you get a whole bunch of people together, you get a whole bunch of filters talking to each other. And these kind of trainings allow people to understand that they walk with filters. And over time, with the personal work with neurolinguistic programming, the personal transformation work, you begin to dissolve and be in control of the filters that you want to have there, and leave them there, and dissolve the ones that no longer serve you or your purpose.
Right.
But understanding that you walk with filters is a huge step in and of itself.
Understanding that
understanding that you walk with filters, you walk
right.
in the world with filters, is a huge thing in and of itself. Because when you understand that you walk with filters, and you understand that other people walk with filters, then you can catch yourself in the act of reacting rather than responding. You can
Mm.
say, am I responding or is my filter reacting?
Oh my, that's a big one.
Right? And it takes practice and just knowing that you walk with these filters in the world and you have your own model of the world,
Right.
and you can begin to be aware of that. And your groups can be aware of that. And it allows them to move through those processes of, you know, from storming to performing, you know.
From storming to performing. We talked about that yesterday on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
So fascinating. There's a guest asks Shelly, she's like, this is good. And then she says, deconstruct. Love it. Hi, Shelly. Thanks for tuning in and for posting your comments. I think it's something we probably need to talk more about, and we'd love to have you back
Oh,
on a Tuesday when a lot of our guests usually tune in because they're so used to seeing us on Tuesdays.
yeah,
But this conversation, we must dive into it just a little bit more. I think we're only touching the surface.
absolutely.
And if more of us knew or aware, not you don't really have to know because we don't know everything, but
Mm-hmm.
we bring it to light,
Mm-hmm.
what NLP is, how it works, the process, the techniques,
Mm-hmm.
and exactly what Shelley said and what we talked about, to deconstruct already what's inside. It's basically starting fresh.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You're bringing yourself back to as much as possible this sort of blank slate to be able to create from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, this conversation was delicious.
Well, you know, I geek out over this stuff. It is just it's the air that I breathe. I love talking about it, and I absolutely love talking about it with you.
Oh, me
This has been
too. I love having these conversations. It's I think there's so much, like you said, once we're receptive and open to learning a little bit more,
Mhm.
then we can offer more and we can serve better.
Yeah, absolutely.
We could
Absolutely.
definitely serve better.
Yeah.
So my keynote is that while I tried to, always limit my bias as much as possible by interviewing, only women whom I did not know and sticking to the same set of questions for ongoing interviews, it's impossible to completely remove my personal experience from this discussion. And without it, I would have not been able to undertake this in the first place.
Mhm.
So the continual theme surfaced that if true equality in the workplace is what we are after, then sooner or later we have to tackle the issues. And I'll probably change, issues to maybe programming or, internal dialogues that are distinctive to us. And
Mhm.
especially in the workplace, we need to recognize we're not alone.
Mhm.
And I know that many of you are having these transparent and courageous dialogues with the people around you and trying to figure out how you feel about all this.
Mhm.
So understand that, or ponder as well, that change starts with us, and how you resolve these questions can be distinctive to you as women of color and of diverse backgrounds.
Mhm.
This will reflect your personal and professional experiences through your own community and workspace. What's essential is that you give yourself some grace. And we talked about this yesterday.
Yeah.
Give yourself some grace, go through the process. And what's crucial is that you do that. And while enough of us can do just that over time, we'll have a united front. Transparency and authenticity is key. So we
Mhm.
need to be true to ourselves to be able to create that transformation.
Absolutely.
These conversations it's a safe space here. And I want to thank you so much again, Maisha, for being here, today. It's such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure. Any value that I can provide and education, I'm very clear that it's a ripple, and I never know how far out that ripple's going to go. And so
Right.
I am here to be of value and to contribute and part of that is to transform this world.
Right. One person at a time.
Absolutely.
Thank you again.
Thank you.